Thank you. It's an honor to be here. On January 8, 1948, the presiding judge summoned Chortitza Mennonite Francisca Reimers to the stand as a witness in the famous Einsatzgruppen trials. The defendant, Matthias Graf of Einsatzgruppe C, was on trial for war crimes, membership in a criminal organization, and crimes against humanity. Through Reimers' testimony, we know that she directly contributed to the killing of Jews and others targeted by the Nazis. Adina Epp was also a Chortitza Mennonite, but someone who made very different choices. Her diary reveals her complicity with the Third Reich, but on a much lower everyday level. While neither Epp nor Reimers are representative of all Chortitza Mennonites, they do illustrate that degrees of complicity differ dramatically. And by Chortitza, I'm referring to the Old Colony with its villages along the right bank of the Dnieper River in Ukraine. During the war, survival often influenced the choices of Chortitza Mennonites. They then, though, had to navigate a post-war world where action or inaction during the war haunted their ability to later receive assistance from the Allied powers. The post-World War II immigration process clearly reveals the lasting effects of wartime choices. Chortitza Mennonites, who often saw themselves as victims yet had cooperated with Nazi Germany, were able to successfully recharacterize wartime involvement. The shifting loyalties and evolving identities of Chortitza Mennonites began much earlier than 1945 with the end of the war. Therefore, my larger research project transcends traditional periodizations and geographies. It begins in early 20th century Ukraine and extends to the late 50s in North America. During the first part of the 20th century, sentiment toward ethnic Germans soured. This was a profound shift for individuals like Francisca Reimers, who were born in Chortitza during a relatively peaceful time and whose generation grew up attending German language schools and churches. However, ethnic Germans in Ukraine quickly became well acquainted with minimizing their German ethnicity during the 1920s and 1930s. Adina Epp, born in 1924, grew up speaking both German and Russian fluently. Yet many families lost their property, their families, and their husbands despite attempts to hide religious observance, participate in collectives, and otherwise fit in. The NKVD took Adina Epp's father to Siberia in 1934. 3 years later, Francisca Reimers' wealthy land-owning husband Cornelius also disappeared. Conflict between one's ethnic German identity and Soviet citizenship only intensified when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the early summer of 1941. Identifying ethnic Germans as a suspect minority by the Soviet Union, Soviet authorities conscripted them to build defenses, dig trenches, and then attempted to move them eastward. Francisca Reimers' story illustrates the lack of real choice that many had at this time. On August 25, 1941, Soviet General Tchaikovsky summoned Reimers to Soviet military headquarters in Dnipropetrovsk and gave her two options: become a spy for the Soviets or go to Siberia. While there are valid reasons to suspect the truthfulness of Reimers' testimony, what we do know is that Reimers framed her acceptance of the Soviet assignment in terms of survival and the desire to protect her child. In September 1941, Reimers surrendered to the German army and Matthias Graf's subunit of the Einsatzgruppe C. The Germans should have shot Reimers as the NKVD spy, but Reimers later argued that she evaded punishment because she volunteered to work for the Nazis. In September and October of 1941, Einsatzgruppe C published news of multiple Jewish executions. They, quote, cleared the country of Jews, the population shot, and the villages themselves destroyed, end quote. Between June and October 1941, the Einsatzgruppe C killed more than 51,000 people. Regardless of the details that Reimers left out or altered in her retelling, one thing is certain: She was in the midst of these brutal murders. When the German army rolled through Chortitza, ethnic Germans like Adina Epp welcomed them. Epp's post-war life was dictated by the decisions that began during the German occupation. Ethnic Germans aided the advancing German forces by remaining instead of evacuating, sharing information about the area, and working for German Nazi agencies. The Soviets viewed all of these activities as traitorous. Therefore, Chortitza Mennonites knew that their survival was linked to German victory and to subscribing to Nazi policy. This was not a simple task, however. Mennonites had to repeatedly prove that they were German enough, first in Ukraine, then after resettlement to Germany, and often during resettlement in Poland. The Volksdeutsche Mittelstelle, or FOMI, an SS organization tasked with overseeing ethnic Germans living outside the Reich, registered Chortitza villagers. The FOMI added those deemed German enough to the Deutsche Volksliste, which was a central registration site. The FOMI transported Epp's family and others from the Chortitza settlement by train or by wagon trek in October 1943 to resettlement camps in Poland. As a school teacher, Adina Epp moved from school to school in Poland, but her family and many of those who remained in the resettlement camps often had the option of accepting farms originally owned by Jews and Poles. Accepting this land made ethnic Germans complicit with the crimes committed against the previous owners. However, rejecting that land could also make them ideologically suspect. Some chose to risk the displeasure of the FOMI and remain in resettlement camps rather than indirectly participate in the murder of the Jews and Poles. Individuals in the camps often had little choice regarding whether or not to aid the war effort. Reimers worked in an explosives factory as an informant for Matthias Graf, who asked questions about the forced laborers working there. Adina Epp thought she might have to stop teaching in order to work in a munitions factory, and her father and brother were often gone on work assignments. After the war, Allied authorities viewed these actions as clear support for Nazi Germany's war aims. World War II came to an end, of course, in May 1945 in Europe. Although no longer literally caught between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, Soviet victory in occupied Germany confronted ethnic Germans with the threat of repatriation back to the Soviet Union. As other scholars have pointed out in their work, the threat of repatriation drove Chortitza Mennonites to argue for a non-Soviet identity, as well as view immigration as a only hope. The immigration process illuminated Chortitza Mennonite actions during the war, as they tried to avoid repatriation while navigating the complicated process of immigration. Government and military authorities asked awkward questions about wartime involvement. To evade repatriation, Chortitza Mennonites fled westward from Poland during the winter of 1944-1945 as the Soviet army advanced westward. At the war's end, Epp and her family were trapped in Berlin. Reimers, along with other Mennonites, had been able to migrate into the British zone, seeking more sympathetic treatment there. To remove themselves from Soviet encroachment, Chortitza Mennonites tried to seek asylum in unoccupied Holland. Although at first permitted entrance by border guards and officials in response to Dutch-sounding last names, proficiency in Low German and Menno passes, pieces of paper temporarily authorizing entrance, the Soviets soon intervened. In 1946, the Soviet Union threatened to halt the return of Dutch prisoners of war if Holland continued to accept Russian Mennonites. With Holland's borders closed, immigration overseas became the next viable option. Canada and the United States were preferred destinations for many from Chortitza, but South America became an increasingly attractive option because of less stringent immigration laws. Due to the intensive process, immigration was a microscope through which the International Refugee Organization and other immigration officials scrutinized wartime choices. The Mennonite Central Committee, MCC, the relief arm of the Mennonite Church, decided to intervene to help change the perception of Russian Mennonites from ethnic German collaborators to a persecuted religious minority. The MCC leaders and relief workers aided Chortitza Mennonites in each stage of the immigration process. The first step for successful immigration was to qualify for aid through the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, or its predecessor or forerunner, the International Refugee Organization, IRO, as a displaced person. Displaced person, a DP, received food and ration cards, lodging in UN-run camps, access to medical care, and screening for immigration. Those who are not DPs were left under the jurisdiction of the West German government. Allied authorities were not always sympathetic to those claiming to be DPs. In the Funkkasern DP camp outside Munich, the camp director gave the 316 Mennonites from Ukraine an ultimatum: prove that they were DPs or leave. However, Chortitza Mennonites did not qualify as DPs because they were ethnic German. To be a DP, one needed to either have been forcibly removed from their homes or be a citizen of an allied country. Although Chortitza Mennonites had been Soviet citizens prior to 1939, many were wary of touting their ties to the USSR because of fears of repatriation. Ethnic Germans from Chortitza wanted to acquire visas to Canada or the US and receive immigration aid from UN organizations. Yet, they did not want American or British officials to hand them over to the Soviet Union, a real possibility in the aftermath of the war. One's citizenship and identity was crucial, therefore. Caught between policy on the one side and Soviet aims on the other, ethnic German Mennonites turned to a third option: reinventing their identity. DP registration forms reveal that most Mennonites claimed a religious ethnic identity separate from other standard national identities. Dutch Mennonite appeared on many forms, and comparing these claimed identities to German immigration records filled out only a few years earlier revealed a shift that occurred from being 100% German in 1943 to denying their German heritage in 1945. By arguing that they were Dutch Mennonite rather than ethnic German, Russian Mennonites distanced themselves from their close cultural, linguistic, and relational ties to Germany. Cornelius Krahn, a professor of Mennonite history, argued that Russian Mennonites never became part of the German culture or economy, that they only adopted the German language because of German church services and German language Bibles. A Dutch identity also insulated Chortitza Mennonites from Soviet repercussions to an extent. In an attempt to strengthen those ties to the Netherlands, Chortitza Mennonites emphasized their victimization at the hands of the Soviet Union. They argued that because they had experienced persecution in both Prussia and later in Russia, they remained most closely connected to Holland. The argument that Russian Mennonites' national origin was Dutch or stateless enabled many to receive displaced person status in a world where ethnic Germans did not receive UN assistance. The Mennonite part of their identity was, of course, also significant. The only religious ethnic group that the United Nations officially recognized was Jews, and this was, of course, the result of sympathy for them after the Holocaust. However, self-appointed leader in Mennonite John J. Craker, in a letter to American General C.J. Taylor, argued that, quote, Mennonites must be classified as one of the most severely haunted and persecuted groups of people in the world. Only the Jews in Germany can be compared to them, end quote. A few months later, he again wrote that because Mennonites were in a similar position to the Jewish situation, Mennonite should be accepted as a national identifier, or at the very least entitle them to stateless status. Yet, Mennonites had not gone through the Holocaust as Jews had. In the process of claiming an ethnic and national identity, removed from their German and Soviet pasts, previous resettlement by the Fomi continued to haunt Chortitza Mennonites in the post-war period. Ero's 1947 stipulations dictating Mennonite eligibility for DP status hinged on whether or not they willingly left the Soviet Union. Those who were eligible for the Ero assistance included Mennonites from Russia of Dutch origin who had been, quote, displaced into Germany through forced labor or otherwise against their will. On the other hand, those who were not eligible were, quote, Mennonites of German ethnic origin from Soviet Russia who had fled to Germany to avoid falling into the hands of the advancing Allied armies, end quote. As traitors to the Soviet Union, remaining in Chortitza after the German retreat in 1943 was neither a desirable option nor a real choice. While some Chortitza villagers tried to argue that they had not left Chortitza of their own free will, the fact that they had accepted German assistance disqualified them in the eyes of the Ero agents. Furthermore, the 1947 Ero memo concluded that there was not enough evidence to prove the group's Dutch origin, which was also a prerequisite to eligibility. Not only did Russian Mennonites have difficulty convincing the Ero of their Dutch origin, but captured German records housed at the Berlin Document Center revitalized the argument that Chortitza Mennonites had willingly accepted German citizenship during the war. Indeed, between 1941 and 1944, German citizenship had been widely desired by these resettlers. If one did not accept the offered citizenship, the Third Reich often had little use for them, other than as forced laborers. Adina Epp wrote in her diary on February 1st, 1944, that receiving German citizenship gave her, quote, new privileges, but also new responsibilities. She could not have imagined what the consequences would be after the war because she accepted citizenship for the privileges it contained. German records also revealed that some Mennonites had served in the Wehrmacht, Sicherheitsdienst, and Schutzstaffel. Service in the German military SD and SS also made it extremely difficult to immigrate to North America. Despite these obstacles, Chortitza Mennonites were often able to successfully immigrate to North and South America because of the commitment of the Mennonite Central Committee that wielded its influence in Allied circles through close relationships to government leaders. To combat claims that Chortitza Mennonites were ethnic German instead of Dutch, the MCC asked historians to produce briefs proving Mennonite and Dutch similarities through farming methods, last names, and continued contact with Holland. While the Ero never officially accepted the Dutch Mennonite connection, they did allow them to proceed as DPs in many cases. The MCC, through the work of Peter and Elfrieda Dick, for instance, also successfully convinced the American military commander in Berlin to transport Adina Epp and other Russian Mennonites from Berlin to Bremerhaven, where the ship Volendam then sailed to Paraguay. I am still investigating what happened to Francisca Reimers and whether or not she was eventually able to immigrate as well. When in July 1949, the Ero halted the processing of additional Chortitza Mennonites due to questions of German citizenship, the MCC mobilized arguments that Mennonites had only accepted German citizenship under duress. The MCC also lobbied Canadian and U.S. government officials. Ugo Carusi, the U.S. Displaced Persons Commissioner, George Warren from the U.S. State Department, and even Major General Wood Jr. from the U.S. Ero office protested the ban and fully supported the MCC's efforts. In response, Ero Geneva issued a statement in October 1949 regarding the eligibility of Mennonites for immigration. This communique acknowledged that receiving German citizenship did not automatically disqualify Mennonites from DP status since, quote, many persons, Mennonites and others, claimed that they were Volksdeutsche and used German immigration schemes to escape from Russian and communist-dominated areas, end quote. Furthermore, Ero acknowledged that this was often done under some form of duress, quote, or as a matter of routine or almost automatically. As the Cold War heated up, the MCC's arguments became more effective. Regarding military involvement, C.F. Clausen claimed that no new information had surfaced with these finds. The MCC argued that the number of Russian Mennonites who had participated in the military or SS formations was extremely small, and that the MCC did not disagree with Ero's decision to disqualify them from immigration. By framing Russian Mennonite choices during the war against the backdrop of Soviet terror, survival, limited involvement, and at times ignorance, the MCC successfully mounted each hurdle and helped thousands of Mennonites immigrate to North America. Chortitza Mennonites were uniquely caught between the Soviets and Nazis, and effective in reinventing their identities after the war. The spectrum involvement in the Holocaust, illustrated by Franziska Reimers and Adina Epp, was, however, shared with others who had to make difficult, survival-dependent choices during World War II. Thank you.